Lecture 10, The New Proprietaries, the Deep South.
I'd like to speak today about the colonial origins of the Lower South, and in particular I'd like to focus on the colony of South Carolina, because it was one of the most influential and important of the English colonies in North America, and in particular because it was so remarkable for its racial imbalance, for the degree to which slavery was important there, and for the implications it has for our further study of revolutionary and 19th century American history. South Carolina will be an important state, and for that reason, a careful study of the history of colonial South Carolina will shed some light on our later historical researches. Now, South Carolina was founded in 1670, and it wasn't intended to become as important economically as it did in fact become. It started out as a colony of a colony. It was a proprietary colony, and since it was owned privately, it was intended to be a sort of a source of foodstuffs and lumber and grain and things that the West India Islands would need. The reason was that much of the concern that the Board of Trade had with the colonies was about turning them into a paying proposition. It turned out that the West Indies, because they were the source of so much wealth due to sugar, couldn't afford to devote much of their land to foodstuffs, couldn't afford to raise their own cattle. So they needed some source of food so that they could concentrate on the main crop, which was sugar. South Carolina was intended to be the sort of colony of the Caribbean colonies. It was intended to provide bread and foodstuffs and meat for the sugar colonies. It turned out that South Carolina became important in its own right and developed a very thriving plantation economy. But that was an unexpected consequence of a whole series of historical developments during the colonial period. And it's worth examining these in detail because it tells us a great deal about the patterns of slavery and the patterns of economic life that developed during the colonial period. Now, key thing in terms of politics rather than economics, South Carolina was placed in such a way as to provide a barrier for the Chesapeake colonies. The Chesapeake colonies had been founded early in the 17th century. South Carolina, founded in 1670, was intended to provide a sort of buffer against the Spanish who were in St. Augustine and against the French who had already started their move down the Mississippi Valley. The idea was to prevent the Chesapeake from being outflanked and to keep the potentially dangerous forces of both Catholicism and of international rivalries from coming into the Chesapeake. So South Carolina was going to be a colony of secondary importance economically, but of first importance militarily and politically because it had an important strategic position vis-a-vis the other rivals for colonial domination of North America. Now, South Carolina was cited importantly because of the position of the French and the Spanish, but in another sense, South Carolina was cited badly because the coast of South Carolina, which is, of course, the first area to be developed and the first area to be colonized, is a large malarial swamp. It's called the Low Country. There's a very considerable difference geographically between the upcountry and the low country in South Carolina. Much of the subsequent history of South Carolina will revolve around this geographic split because the geography will lend itself to different kinds of economic uses and also different levels of wealth associated with each area. So for those reasons, the geography of South Carolina is crucial in understanding the history of South Carolina. The Low Country, which stretches for some miles inland from the sea, is a large cypress swamp. It is periodically inundated by not just the tides, but also considerable amounts of rain, and it's exposed to hurricanes on a fairly regular basis. Nowadays, we've occasionally seen very large hurricanes in South Carolina, but even a small hurricane or a substantial storm will cause massive flooding in the Low Country. There's always so much water there that any considerable amount of precipitation is a danger to the surrounding area. In addition to the dangers that come from the weather, the Low Country swamp is malarial. And at this time, in the 17th and 18th century, no one knows the true cause of malaria. It turns out to be caused by mosquito bites. Mosquitoes transfer a certain kind of parasite into the bloodstream. At the time, it was simply thought that malaria was caused by the bad air that comes up and out of swamps. So on the one hand, although South Carolina needed to be founded for both political and economic reasons, it is a most unlikely and unwelcoming place to start a colony. It's possible to go up the Cooper River, but on the other hand, although it is possible to move up country, once one moves up country by following the rivers, you get away from the very fertile soils that we find in the low country swamp. So it's a trade-off. On the one hand, the low country is very dangerous because malaria kills off a very large number of the early inhabitants. And yet, on the other hand, the most fertile soil in South Carolina and some of the most fertile soil in the United States will be found in the low country area, in these swamps. So there's a sort of contradictory set of imperatives: fertility of the soil versus mortality among the people. A third important early development in the history of South Carolina is the emergence of Charleston as a sort of, or Charlestown as it was called then, as a sort of commercial metropole. If you think about the coast of colonial America, you will find that there are only a small number of important cities. All of the important cities are port cities. They are involved in commerce and trade. The only large port city that develops in the colonial South is Charlestown. And for that reason, it develops a special group of merchants, a sort of commercial elite. In addition to that, it has a large number of artisans, and many of these artisans turn out to be slaves. So there will be quite a considerable amount of difference between the urban culture that develops in Charlestown and the urban culture that develops in Philadelphia or Boston. In many respects, Charleston, or Charlestown as it was called then, is a unique commercial and artisanal culture, and for that reason it will have a tremendous amount of subsequent influence on the development of colonial South Carolina, and also the influence will grow once we get into the state of South Carolina. Now, in the 17th century, when South Carolina was founded, the key question for anyone who wants to plant a colony is the control of labor. If you want to make money in an agricultural economy, there are two things you have to have. The first is you have to have land, and the second thing you have to have is labor. Now, due to just the nature of the of the geography and the nature of the proprietary grant that had been allowed to the proprietors of South Carolina, they had no problem finding land. They had more land than they knew what to do with. To a great extent today, even, South Carolina is not an especially densely populated state. So there's a very large number of there are a very large amount of land that's accessible for exploitation. The problem is, how are we going to get labor? The control of labor will determine what kind of money you can make in South Carolina and how fast you can make it. Remember that South Carolina is not founded for religious reasons. It's not like New England, where people go there because of religious problems back at home. They went there to make money. It had a speculative air about it. There was a sort of boomtown mentality, particularly in the 17th century. And for that reason, the first question that everyone had in mind was, how can I get control of labor? And second of all, where will I market the things that we produce from South Carolina? So they were trying to find a way to turn land and labor into cash. And that was the main problem that the first generation of Carolinians had to solve. Now, amazingly enough, South Carolina's fundamental constitutions, the earliest document which organized the government, was written by the English philosopher John Locke. Locke was a patron of one of the proprietors, or rather was under the patronage of one of the proprietors. He decided that, or he was asked to put together a plan of government which would allow for the stable development of South Carolina, and particularly it was organized around the idea of creating a quasi-feudal hierarchy in South Carolina. Now, this shows or underscores the difference between theory and practice. In theory, South Carolina was to exist for the benefit of the sugar colonies, and in theory it was to have a whole series of aristocrats called landgraves and caciques and manor-owning individuals who would supervise and lend a sort of aristocratic balance to the vast majority of society that were understood to be white yeomen. Slaves and slavery did not figure greatly into the plans of those who put together the first generation of South Carolinian immigrants. They were looking just to develop the land, and they didn't think that it would be proper use of slave labor. Slave labor could be used more profitably in the sugar islands. So they expected a highly stratified English society of small yeoman farmers and large landowning barons, essentially. In other words, they were trying to replicate a quasi-feudal structure here in America. Unfortunately, it did not, or fortunately, depending on how one looks at it, theory did not meet practice. And the way South Carolina developed practically was nothing like what John Locke imagined in his fundamental constitutions. In the first case, there were there was a tendency to settle along the coast despite the fact that it was malarial. Remember that the key thing to consider if you want to turn land and labor into money is you have to find a way to market your goods. And the easiest way to transport large, bulky agricultural items is by water. So you could go up the small rivers, but there's no river comparable to the Hudson in South Carolina, so there's nothing that suggests itself in that direction. And on the other hand, there are lots of islands called the Sea Islands that dot the coast off the low country, and they're admirable areas to engage in agricultural production, and they're relatively easy to bring under control. And thirdly, there's little danger from Indian attack, at least if you're on the islands. So for reasons of protection, reasons of economy, the early planting of South Carolina was, for the most part, in the low country coast. Now, next question was, how are they going to develop economically? Well, the cattle trade thrived in South Carolina as it did in no other colony in English North America. The reason was fairly simple: climate. It is possible to let cattle loose in South Carolina, and they need not be rounded up except when you need to either milk them or if you intend to slaughter them. Elsewise, it's possible to let them run free. The winters are very mild in South Carolina. The animals don't need to be put indoors. They don't need the intensive care that was necessary, say, up in Boston or up in New York. For that reason, the cattle multiplied enormously. And on account of that, the trade in meat and the trade in hides became very important at the end of the 17th century. So the cattle trade, strangely enough, was very important. And although a few white indentured servants came over, because South Carolina was so unhealthy, it was not a popular landing point for poor white workers. If you could come to America, even as an indentured servant, you'd rather go someplace where you were less likely to get malaria and less likely to die. So it was hard, at least particularly in the very beginning, to get people to come over to a place that's as unhealthy as low country South Carolina. Instead, there was a gradual increase in the number of slaves, but it wasn't an especially significant number because the whole population was relatively small in the 17th century. What did happen, though, is that the slaves, at least initially, were put in charge of the cattle, and they were described at the time as cowboys. And in fact, the origin of the American cowboy will be found on the coast of South Carolina, and it turns out the first cowboys were black, which is a surprising turn of events. We don't associate cowboys with South Carolina nor with slaves, but in fact that's the way it worked in the United States. And it all has to do with the fact that cows flourish in South Carolina and did very well there. Now, of course, the cows wander around, and they're branded, one assumes, so it's possible to tell who owns what. But this also creates a necessity or helps create a climate for land speculation. The way in which you're going to make money is to control land and labor. The first thing you want to get control of is land, and there's lots of it. So there's quite a speculative fever, quite a boom in land patents in South Carolina. And in particular, once you have a large area of land, then you can let your cattle graze freely. And if you just allow for the natural kind of Malthusian increase of your cattle, and they do increase roughly geometrically here, well, the result will be in 10 or 15 years that you'll have a vast herd of livestock and quite a good income with a minimum amount of labor needed to supervise that. So it's the first way to make big money in South Carolina. And South Carolina was always a big money colony. In addition to cattle, they also tried to grow some provisions, but the climate wasn't really suited to it. The swamps, while they were fertile, were not an ideal place to grow grain. And so they were looking around, trying to find some other source of income. And they found it in something called naval stores. And nowadays, since navies have changed quite considerably, naval stores will require some explanation. In the process of cutting down pine trees, and any of you who have ever been to South Carolina know there are vast pine forests there. In the process of cutting those down and burning the pine trees, what comes out is turpentine and pitch. And turpentine and pitch are necessary for the sealing of boats and ships. And England, of course, has a huge navy and a large commercial fleet, and there's also a fairly substantial commercial fleet here in the colonies. As a result, there was quite a considerable demand for these naval stores. What's important about this is that the naval stores industry was based upon the fact that the Board of Trade gave a bounty for each barrel of naval stores, barrel of pitch and turpentine produced, and as a result, tremendous numbers of pine trees were cut down, and this helps generate the need for slave labor, and that's what becomes so important towards the end of the 17th century. Now, what's important about this is that not only do slaves start to come in larger and larger numbers as we move towards 1700. But, very importantly, when you cut down pine forests, the result, and not an unintended byproduct, is cleared land. And once you've started to clear the land and you're making a profit on the clearing of it, that starts to give an extra economic incentive to the further increase in the number of slaves. In other words, if you're making money clearing land at 10 acres a year, you'll make 3 times that money at 30 acres a year. So planters were willing to mortgage their lands, which now had quite considerable value, so that they could get more slaves on speculation. And since the price of slaves wasn't especially great, and they were making tremendous amounts of money off this cleared land, the result was a boom in the number of slaves. And as a result of that boom in the number of slaves, by 1708, more than half of South Carolina's population is black slaves. It is the only place in America that ever had that disproportion of races. And it's one of the concomitant results of that is that the growth of a vast number of slaves, who were more than half of the total population, meant that a certain percentage at the top of white society was enormously wealthy. By the time of the American Revolution, the richest people in North America live in Charleston. And the reason why they're the richest people in North America is because there's the second or third generation of Carolinians that have been making tremendous amounts of money from the importation of slaves, the clearing of land, and the production of staple crops. Now, at first, the West Indies trade made South Carolina's economy thrive. But very clearly, it wasn't going to stay that way. As the number of slaves increases, and as the amount of cleared land increases, something else has to be found as a way of solving these economic difficulties. And the way in which they were solved is by the search for a staple crop. In 1695, rice was imported for the first time to South Carolina, and it turns out that rice grows wonderfully well in the swampy lowland areas, the areas which had been patented first, and the areas which had been cleared first. And it turns out that rice is generated a very high rate of profit. For all those reasons, the economy boomed still further. The importation of slaves increased dramatically, and South Carolina, certainly by 1730, was exporting more rice than any other thing that they exported. More than deerskins, more than cattle, more than lumber, more than naval stores. Rice very quickly became the most important staple crop. Now, as the society of South Carolina begins to expand outside of the low country, into the middle country and the up country, certain characteristic problems developed. The first and most important of these characteristic problems is the conflicts with the Indians. The Indians were numerous in South Carolina, and they were much more powerful and somewhat better organized than they had been, say, at the time in New England during the time of King Philip's War. South Carolina has a series of Indian wars in the early part of the 18th century, which fundamentally change and have a definite economic and political impact on the subsequent growth of the colony. The first of these great wars was the Tuscarora War, and that was fought for 2 years, longer than most of the wars in longer than most of the wars in colonial America. And in addition, the Tuscaroras, rather than being destroyed, were driven up north, outside of South Carolina. They were driven up into the Iroquois Confederacy in New York. So the Tuscarora were displaced from their land and had a sort of mass exodus northward, trying to get out from under the South Carolinians. The second of the great wars that they have is called the Yamasee War. That goes on for 3 years, from 1715 to 18. And that is the largest colonial Indian war that was fought in the English part of North America. It goes on for 3 years. An enormous amount of destruction was caused, and over 1,000 colonists are killed. Large numbers of people are driven inward off the land they had expanded to, and South Carolina pulls back about 1715 or 18, and a large part of the outlying colony is desolated. The perimeter of defense went for about 25 or 30 miles outside of Charleston itself, and everything else was left to the Indians. For the most part, it was burned. Now, one of the things that was unique about the Indian Wars in South Carolina is this. Because the Carolinians had become so successful at raising cattle, the Indians had a ready supply of food right there. So when they came in, of course, it was no big deal for an Indian to stalk a cow. Right? I mean, they kill wildlife. stalking a cow and killing it, not a problem for them. And there were hundreds, literally thousands of cows roaming free in the low country. So that means that in the wintertime, the Indians did not have the necessity of going back and looking for food or taking some time off. They could keep the pressure up because the settlers were kind enough to provide them with a ready source of food all around wherever one looked. So for that reason, this is a particularly bitter war, and it lasted 3 years, which is longer than most of the Indian wars in colonial America did last. Now, another important fact about this is that since the perimeter of defense was 25 to 30 miles outside of Charleston, that's almost exclusively low country territory, and it's almost exclusively those parts of South Carolina which had been patented early on by large landowners. Everybody else, the people that came later that were outside of that 30-mile perimeter, usually they were poorer because they had come later. They hadn't had the chance to accumulate wealth. And in addition to that, they didn't have much in the way of slaves or portable property. For that reason, at the end of the Yamasee War in 1718, a substantial portion of the white settlers in the colony were impoverished and had nothing because their houses had been burned, their crops had been taken. Whatever it is that they were doing outside of the perimeter is now over. And they still had big debts. It's not like your debts were going to be forgiven merely because of an Indian war. Many of them were economically very hard-pressed. On the other hand, inside that 30-mile perimeter, business as usual. Rice continues to be grown. Land is cleared for naval stores. For that reason, the people that had the most money did the best during the Yamasee War because most of the competition was cut out. And second of all, they never suffered any real interruption in their economic activities. For that reason, they continued to flourish and thrive. And in addition to that, they could buy up land or buy up debts fairly quickly. Other people who had been burned out of their land were forced in many cases to sell their slaves and sell them at a deep discount. It was possible then for a small percentage of society to engross a very large number of slaves and to buy land very cheaply. So that meant that they could speculate in land and they could use the money that they got from the crops brought in during the Indian War to that purpose. So it turns out then the pattern of Indian warfare in South Carolina is very important in developing a small elite of very large-scale land and slaveholders that will have a tremendous influence throughout the subsequent history of South Carolina. When we get to the 19th century and you look at the pivotal role played by South Carolina and by particularly the slaveholding elite in South Carolina, you will find upon looking backward that the foundation for that elite is laid in the early part of the 18th century. Much of it is a kind of unintended consequence of the Yamasee War. Now, it's worth thinking a little bit about the environmental changes before I leave the topic of the Indians. Although the Indians, the Yamasee War is the biggest attempt by the Indians to roll back the tide of European expansion, it is obviously too late by the time the Yamasee War comes. And here's why. If you compare South Carolina to New York, you will find that the trade in beaver pelts up in New York fundamentally changed Indian society. First of all, it brought it into the market for European goods, but second of all, the Indians were very good at catching beavers. Once you catch beavers and you take them out of a given area, it takes a long time for them to recover, especially if you've harvested them and harvested them and harvested them to the point where there are very few left. The result of that is changes in the environment. No more beaver dams, changes in the way rivers flow and things like that. Well, something analogous happened in the colonial South. The deerskin trade through Charleston was trade between white traders and Indians who would catch the deer, skin them, bring them back in. In the first case, it brought Indians within the domain of the market for European goods. That certainly changes a culture. Second of all, it decreased the number of deer, the number of large game animals in that part of the South. For that reason, the Indians could no longer continue their habitual ways of life. It was a crisis, not just in economic terms, but also in political terms, that the Indians sought to avert by, say, trying to roll back the tide of colonial expansion. It was a doomed effort, but you can see how the changes in the environment and changes in the culture of the Indians are going to make some such stand necessary. In South Carolina, because the Yamasee were a large tribe and they were supported by the Creeks, who were a very large nation further inland, the fighting was particularly bitter. In every case, though, the attempt to roll back the tide of European immigration simply was an impossibility. Now, there's a a triangular relationship between the races in colonial South Carolina. We have red, white, and black. Clearly, after the Yamasee War, things are not working out well for the Indians. They put together an unfortunate sort of a truce. The South Carolinian settlers are guaranteed a certain degree of autonomy and also the capacity to expand further into the backcountry. And in addition, the increase of peace, the increase of security, the decreasing threat posed by the Indians entailed the idea that now South Carolina was safe for slavery. In other words, it had been kind of a dicey proposition at the end of the 17th century, at the beginning of the 18th century, to bring slaves in. You never knew when the Indians were going to come in and kill them, or when they were going to run away. It was very easy to run away to some place like St. Augustine, or it was easy to run away and start and try and integrate oneself with the Indian tribes. That was attempted by some black slaves as well. But once the Yamasee War is over, the Indians serve as trackers for runaway slaves so they are in the pay of the white slave owners. What this does then is find some utility from the perspective of the slave owners in the remaining Indians, and also manage to keep the slaves docile and make it more difficult for them to run away. And the development of slavery in South Carolina in the 18th century is the big news about South Carolina. That's what makes South Carolina the peculiar state that it is, with the very specific social structure that it has. By 1708, as I said, a majority of the population is black. This continues up, black majority continues up on to at least about 1750, and then again in the 19th century, there will again, prior to the American Civil War, there will be a majority of black slaves in the colony. What made this possible is, first of all, the rice trade. In 1731, the Board of Trade takes rice off the list of enumerated articles. And what that means is that they can freely trade it throughout Europe. And that means that they can make a bundle. In other words, up to about 1730, rice trade had been profitable, but it only had a limited market. After 1731, the rice trade was an open, free market kind of an activity, and for that reason, South Carolinians, who were in the position to make the money from the rice trade, made a phenomenal amount of money. They became the richest elite in colonial America. On the other hand, there were certain unhappy or dangerous demographic consequences to this. In the first case, blacks dominated not just South Carolina, but particularly low country South Carolina. Remember that I said that these malarial swamps were very dangerous? Well, they posed different amounts of danger to different groups of people. White people died like flies there. You couldn't persuade European immigrants or European indentured servants to go there because everyone knew how unhealthy it was. But it turns out that many of the slaves brought over from Africa had sickle cell trait. Are you familiar with sickle cell anemia? Well, it's a problem in the black community today, and it's a genetic disease. Now, the key thing is that those who have the sickle cell trait, who are heterozygotes for sickle cell, have an immunity to malaria. In other words, the reason why sickle cell developed in Western Africa is because in West Africa they have swamps and they grow rice. And for that reason, there's a definite, it's an adaptable mutation to be heterozygous for sickle cell. So when slaves are brought into the malarial rice swamps, it's not that they thrive because it's quite a dangerous place. Remember that not all of the slaves will have the sickle cell trait. But since a fair percentage of the slaves do have the sickle cell trait, they die at much reduced rates compared with the Europeans. For this reason, the slave owners concluded with some justice or with some justification that blacks were more suited to this sort of cultivation, to the cultivation of rice in the low country. And for that reason, they said, yes, bring us slave labor. They became committed to slave labor very early in the process, and they felt that there was geographic and climatic reasons why only slaves could cultivate the low country. By 1720 or 30, there were parishes in the low country that were more than 90% slave. In other words, substantial areas of low country South Carolina were essentially West Africa transported to the coast of the United States. It was a remarkable and unique culture. There is nothing like it in the other parts of colonial North America because you don't get that same concentration of slaves with relatively little supervision. Who will you send in as a white overseer? White overseers die on a regular basis. No one wants to volunteer for that job. White owners of slaves don't want to go in and directly supervise if they can avoid it. Why? Because the sickly season carries off people as fast as they go in. This means that there's a tremendous amount of cultural autonomy for the slaves in the Low Country. They are growing rice. They have experienced growing rice in Western Africa, which is where most of the slave trading gets conducted. And for that reason, Low Country South Carolina, and eventually Low Country Georgia as well, will develop a unique sort of culture among the slaves. And it's worth thinking about some of these so this degree of cultural autonomy, because it is unique in colonial North America. In the first case, there's something called Gullah speech, or the Gullah language. Now, Gullah is a shortened form of the word Angola, and what it is African carryovers of language which didn't change when the slaves came to the United States. If you go to the Sea Islands of South Carolina today, unless you have experienced Gullah speech before, you will find it very hard to make yourself understood, and you will certainly not be able to understand the people who are speaking Gullah. There are isolated enclaves of Gullah speakers to this day, and it is not like regular speech. You are almost in a foreign country when you go to the Low Country nowadays. But back in the early colonial, in the colonial period of South Carolina, Gullah speech was a unique development. Gullah, taken from Angola, means that the slaves can communicate using their old traditional languages, and their masters and their overseers can't understand what they're saying. They are the majority in colonial South Carolina. It's quite a remarkable state of affairs. In addition to Gullah speech, there are many African cultural holdovers. Well, language would be one of them, and many of the things that come in, there's a term used in South Carolina. I've done quite a bit of research there. For a turtle, it's called a cooter, right? That's a kind of a country term for a turtle. That actually comes from Nigerian language, kuta, meaning turtle. Many African words like banjo come over from Africa and are brought right into English there. And in addition to that, not only do we have things like language, also elements of religion, things like voodoo, all right? Or not just, I don't mean just Haitian voodoo, but animism, which gets syncretistically mixed up with the sort of Christianity that the slaves are exposed to. Many of those traditional elements get fused together in the Low Country. There is a tradition of root doctoring, which is obviously an African holdover. Much of African culture maintains its integrity in the Low Country due to the fact that the slaves are the majority of society there. And that, of course, promises great profits to the owners, but it also poses great threats. What if the slaves decide to revolt? One of the things that made the slave-owning class in South Carolina worried throughout its entire history is the fact that if the slaves rise up and revolt, how will we keep them down? The slaves are the majority here. And in the Low Country, they're not just a majority, they're 90%. It's a relatively easy move on their part. Well, that sort of resistance to slavery was unusual, but it did happen. More usually, there was a sort of day-to-day pattern of resistance to slavery. In the first case, there was a large amount of freedom given the slaves, not freedom in the sense of political freedom, but rather freedom in the sense of doing their everyday jobs, because South Carolina had the task system. In other places, like the Chesapeake, you'd have an overseer supervising you all day, or supervising the slaves all day. It was no problem for the overseer to do that. But in South Carolina, you couldn't do that. You would assign each slave a given task and then leave for the day. You didn't want to catch malaria, and they would be allowed to organize their time during that day any way they wanted. Once they had their task finished, they could spend the rest of the day doing whatever they wanted. For that reason, there's a high degree of autonomy that the slaves have there. And in addition to that autonomy, there was just everyday obstructionism. Things like breaking implements, or laming a horse, or laming a mule, intentionally acting stupid like you don't understand the directions you've been given. That sort of foot-dragging obstructionism was common, not just in colonial South Carolina, but throughout slavery in the United States, both in the colonial period and in the antebellum period. Slaves, since they didn't get paid anything extra for working hard, they had relatively little interest in working hard for somebody else, as you might imagine. So accidentally, but purposefully, breaking things or not understanding your directions or moving very slowly would all serve the interests of the slave who said, I want to have a minimal amount of dealings with this. It's a kind of resistance that you don't get killed for. Now, in addition to everyday obstructionism, there was a large number of runaways. Because South Carolina was a buffer colony, it was easy to run into the backcountry. It was easy to take off into these trackless swamps. And certainly it was easy to go down to Spanish St. Augustine, and if you got there, you would be given your freedom. The Spanish were playing geopolitical games with North America, and they made it known among the slaves that any slave that got to St. Augustine would immediately be freed, which was a powerful lure. And remember that in a slave economy, labor is capital. You have to buy the slave. You don't pay a wage. So every time you buy a slave, particularly if you buy it on speculation, or if you buy it having mortgaged your land, if the slaves run away, you are in very great trouble. For that reason, the master class that did their best to make sure that runaways would be minimized. They started a series of patrol laws so that the parishes would be patrolled regularly by armed white individuals who would be on the lookout for runaways. They had a series of military adventures against St. Augustine, and eventually what they decided to do was to bring the Indians in and pay them as trackers, because they knew their way around the countryside, and that kept any coalition between black and red from working out. The only exception to that rule is the case of the Florida Seminoles. I don't mean the football team, I mean the tribe of Indians. The Florida Seminoles took runaway black slaves and integrated them into their society, and also certain elements of the European population that just wanted to leave the control of foreign domination. The Seminoles were, to a great extent, a multiracial people. They happened to live in the swamps of Florida, which made them very hard to go in and find, and certainly very hard to fight. They last well into the 19th century. But the Seminoles are an example of an Indian group that was very welcoming to runaway slaves, and of course this makes the slave owners feel that much more uncertain. So there's a considerable amount of anxiety connected with the prospect of making a great deal of money. We had a sort of speculative boomtown mentality for the first part of the 18th century in South Carolina, and I'd be inclined to say that the greatest problem that was faced was how to control this large and ever increasing black population. They even had cases of maroonage. Maroons are runaway slaves that don't run away. Instead, they turn and form a sort of counter culture. They form a sort of counter colony. It happened in Jamaica, because Jamaica is a very large island, but it also happened in South Carolina as well. Bands of Maroons would run away and say, I'm not going to St. Augustine, I'm not going to the Seminoles, I'm going to come up here into the mountains, and I'm going to steal from traders, I'm going to hunt animals, there are lots of cattle in the woods, and I'm going to kind of make a living for myself. Groups of them would get together. Throughout the colonial history of South Carolina, there's every once in a while a reference to groups of Maroons that have been engaging in highway robbery and engaging in murder and engaging in other kind of depredations in the backcountry. They're very hard to find, and that's, again, one of the reasons why the Indians became very important as a sort of ancillary element in the control of the slave population. They knew how to find the Maroons in a way that the Europeans did not. The most important of the patterns of resistance, the most important kind of resistance that we find in the history of South Carolina is called the Stono Rebellion. It's the largest slave rebellion in the history of colonial America, and it happened in 1739. Now, the Stono Rebellion is most interesting. It involved more than 100 rebel slaves. It involved rebel slaves that knew how to use guns and use them quite effectively, and it put a terrible fright into South Carolinians and made them reassess the development of slavery, the development of their economy, and the development particularly of the mechanisms which were to control slaves. What happened is that a small group, about 20 conspirators, got together and decided that they were going to have this revolt. They broke into a storehouse, into a country store that had powder and guns, appropriated those, killed the owners, and then moved around the colony, gathering slaves as they went. They would come into a person's house, kill the white people, and then tell all the slaves that they were certainly going to join this rebellion. Remember, they didn't want to be found out before they had a large group of people put together. And they didn't dare let any slaves get away for fear that one of them would turn informer. So by the time the alarm went out among the whites, there were over 100 men in arms. And it seems likely that there are particular historical reasons within the culture of the slaves in South Carolina why this would have happened in this way. It turns out that in the 1730s in Angola, right, which is where a large percentage of the slaves in South Carolina came from, in Angola there had been internal wars, and the winning side had captured a large number of opposing warriors, enslaved them, and sold them to Europeans on the coast. which means that very likely the people involved in this rebellion are all from Angola, that they all speak the same language, and that they all have experience in making war. They're warriors. Another important element here is that back in Africa, particularly in Angola, harvesting rice, working on rice crops is woman's work. It's not something a man does. It would be a sort of degradation for a man to be expected to do woman's work. This is the time when rice planting is becoming very important in South Carolina. These warriors who are not at all afraid to take up arms and who were bunched together in large groups without very much supervision felt that they were degraded by being forced to perform woman's work. As a result of that, some discussion is undertaken within the slave groupings, and it's easy to do because there's very little supervision and a large number of them, and they say, let's have a revolt. They know how to use firearms. They know where firearms are located. They break in, and that's what gets the Stono Rebellion of 1739 going. And there are many African holdovers. For example, the use of talismans, the idea being that if you have a particular kind of talisman, you can't get killed, was one of the holdovers from earlier African religion and earlier African military traditions. And although it doesn't prevent you from getting killed, it does, in fact, raise the morale of the troops and make a rebellion that much more likely. Now, unfortunately, fortunately, this rebellion, while it took perhaps 100 lives or so, was crushed quickly. As soon as the word got out among the whites, all adult white males, the entire militia was called out. A whole series of mounted cavalry units came out and wiped out the rebellion, and it took about a week to make sure they had gotten all the stragglers. Thereafter, although there wasn't much chance of an immediate rebellion, on the other hand, it certainly does seem that South Carolinians knew they were sitting on a time bomb, that it was potentially very dangerous for them to have such a large racial disproportion in the Low Country, for them to continue importing slaves, all of whom knew a language that none of the whites understood. There was a whole series of changes that were introduced in the wake of the Stono Rebellion that are very important for considering the history of slavery in South Carolina. The first important change is the Slave Code of 1740. Now, what the Slave Code of 1740 did, and this was in effect right on into the Revolutionary period, the Slave Code of 1740 greatly circumscribed the freedom that blacks had. Now, they didn't have much freedom to begin with, but de facto, certain things had been allowed to black slaves that were strictly speaking against the law. So, for example, it had been a common thing for blacks to sell things in market that they grew on their own. That was no longer allowed. It was a common thing for blacks to be, at the end of their task, when they had finished their task, to be able to go from one plantation to another to visit, or just to go out hunting or fishing or do what they were doing, or whatever they wished. That was circumscribed, too, with a series of pass laws. In order for a slave to go off his master's property, he had to have a written pass from the master. To prevent these passes from being forged, it was made illegal to teach blacks the English language. They weren't able to read and write. Or, I mean, not the verbal form, but the written form of the English language. The key thing is that then blacks would not have access to information like newspapers, but also couldn't forge passes for one another. The idea then was to increase the amount of surveillance and to limit their freedom of movement, to limit their ability to engage in marketplace activities. In other words, the element of racial inequality was becoming institutionalized, and it was becoming not just institutionalized, but the details of the lives of black slaves were being increasingly regulated by the government as opposed to the individual master. Most importantly, manumission, which is the practice of giving slaves their freedom in return for some excellent service, was no longer legal by individual masters. Once the Slave Code of 1740 was passed, manumission was exclusively the province of the government. So, for example, if a slave were to turn in potential rebels, then it was certainly possible for the government to manumit the slave. But that's the only circumstance in which that would be allowed. Free slaves were thought of as being an anomaly and a danger, and for that reason they wanted to make sure that manumission was kept at an absolute minimum. It was very clear then, with the Slave Code of 1740, that the white slave-holding class was highly anxious about their circumstances, but they had made a bargain with the devil and didn't dare give up slavery. So what they decided to do was to regulate with increasing severity the lives of the slaves that lived in the Low Country. Patrol laws were passed. There was an increased stringency for the requirement that there be at least one white man for every 10 slaves in the Low Country. They were trying to redress that racial imbalance. They never completely succeeded, but they did manage to tighten up and to institutionalize the element of racial caste. Now, I'll conclude with some discussion of the master class in South Carolina, the people that benefited from this. Because if more than half of society is made up of slaves, then the top 5 or 10% of society has to be enormously wealthy. And it turns out that the wealthiest and most cohesive would-be aristocrats in America are to be found in South Carolina, particularly in the Low Country. Those whites who could not afford to buy slaves, who could not manage to get control of labor, were gradually squeezed out and moved into the upcountry. And one of the results of this is that as plantation slavery takes firm root in South Carolina, what we will find is that this tendency to move up and down the coast will influence the development of Georgia. I'll close on this note. Georgia was founded as a refuge for white yeoman farmers, the people that had either been criminals or debtors back in England. And that's what had been hoped by James Oglethorpe in 1732 when he founded the colony. He wouldn't allow slavery there because he thought it would be bad for these yeoman farmers. In fact, what happened is that South Carolinians, anxious for more land, petitioned London, tried to get slavery introduced, and by 1749, only 17 years after the founding of the colony, slavery was introduced in Georgia, and what that did was turn Georgia into the buffer colony, Georgia into the new zone of plantation slavery, and for that reason, at that point, South Carolina had solidified as a plantation society.
I'm Tom Rollins, president of the Teaching Company. We hope you've enjoyed the lectures on these tapes. To order more courses or to receive a copy of our most recent catalog, call 1-800-TEACH-12. That's 1-800-TEACH-12. Or visit our website at www.teachco.com. Thank you very much for listening.